at the time of 1994 and where South Africa was on the global stage, and kind of the pressures of being a relatively smaller nation, and and the kind of the constraints the ANC was under. I'm just wondering what the two of you think about that in terms of the trajectory of the ANC becoming neoliberalized, or if you would agree with this characterization. Because I mean, of course, that I agree, Sean, with the sort of constraints that you're talking about, but then in terms of the political character and the sort of the failure, you could say, of a redistributive project, and class polarization, is this solely due to kind of these more macro factors? Is there also, what do we say about kind of the growing like Black bourgeoisie or class polarization within South Africa? So I'm just kind of toss that back.
Yeah, I think that's a crucial, and I think appreciating the macroeconomic constraints that the ANC faced is important, but thinking about what Sean just said now about how there's always been this right-wing current that's present in South Africa, I think in a large way that's been the default of South African politics. It's only really becoming legible now. So when you think about the African National Congress, its class character from the beginning has always been this elite Black political project from its founding in the early 20th century. And it's always been an African nationalist political party. I mean, in the 1940s, you had key ANC figures like A.B. Zuma, even Nelson Mandela, talking about how the aspiration of the ANC wasn't necessarily the recharting of the political order in South Africa, but finding space for the emergence of a Black middle class and for Black people to participate in the capitalist economy. And it was only really when they entered into coalition with the Communist Party that they were sort of forced to position themselves as a radical political party. But it's always been this broad church that's included different political tendencies, and the dominant political tendency has been this African nationalist orientation. So that when the 1990s came, there were a lot of figures within the ANC who were not interested in a redistributive economic program, who saw the integration of South Africa into the world capitalist economy as providing an opportunity for aspirant Black capitalists to find their own venues of accumulation. That became sort of formalized under the Black Economic Empowerment Project, and so on and so forth. And the ANC throughout its history has never really been interested in articulating what its economic program was. So probably the most sophisticated document of that was the Freedom Charter. And the Freedom Charter was this document drafted collectively with many different stakeholders, and so never really was an ANC document, such that by the time the late 1980s came, the early 1990s came, the ANC was under a lot of pressure, and because of its inability to clarify what its economic outlook was, also its lack of interest in doing so, because they did have a vested interest in being integrated into the capitalist economy, it capitulated easily. And I think that a lot of the time when we think back about that moment, people will portray it or think of it in the popular imagination as being as a sellout moment, and the sellout moment because of those macroeconomic pressures. But I think that can sometimes underplay the extent to which the ANC always had this interest of integrating Black South Africans into capitalism rather than fighting for something different. And even though it entered into alliance with organizations such as the South African Communist Party, and always stuck to its sort of theory of social change, which was the so-called National Democratic Revolution, when, in classic Marxist-Leninist fashion, it said we would have a first stage of national liberation, and that will be led by the ANC as the vanguard of Black South Africans. And then we will have the second stage of socialist transformation led by or realized through class struggle. But that was always postponed, that was always deferred. And I think that what a lot of people are starting to realize now is that's the case, but they're also, I think, apropos of what Sean was saying just now, a lot of the frustration at the ANC is sometimes not because of its inability to develop an economic redistributive program, but because of its inability to create that black bourgeoisie that is supposed to deracialize South African capital and replace white and foreign capital with an indigenous capitalist class. That's basically what the politics of the so-called radical economic transformation bloc in South African politics is. And that includes everyone from factions of the African National Congress to the economic freedom fighters, to people in a lot of different organizations. And I think thinking about what would be the most frightening thing about this emergence of a new right in South Africa, I think Action SA, which is the political party that is led by Herman Mashaba, as Sean was talking about now. He was the former mayor of Johannesburg. I think something that Action SA lacks is its sort of refusal to be a traditional party. So basically the way it designs itself is as a sort of civic populist front. So very similar to the Five Star Movement in Italy. It says, we will have a devolution of power. We will allow people to directly elect who they want their councillors to be, and so on and so forth. And I think that might be one of its limitations to really developing a mass character, because it doesn't really provide you as much opportunity for careerism and rising through the ranks and finding a way to use access to political resources for enrichment. I think what would be frightening is thinking ahead of the general election in 2024, is if all of these sort of, at the moment, loosely organized coalitions of RET sympathetic politicians and so on and so forth decided that they wanted to organize themselves into new political force to challenge the ANC, or if, for example, the EFF more directly embraces that kind of politics, which is something that they've started to do recently, sort of parroting these right-wing talking points of putting South Africans first, in spite of the EFF claiming to be a Pan-African political party, being very sympathetic to Jacob Zuma, cozying up with traditional leaders, which in South Africa have historically been an oppressive form of government. So I think there's a lot happening now, and it's very difficult to predict what it's all going to coalesce into. But I think it's really a reflection of how a lot of political currents in South Africa, which had previously been masked under a radical politics, are starting to reveal themselves to be what they really are, which is reactionary.
I mean, I'll add a couple of other things. I mean, I think it's useful to take it also historically. I think to the point of they're the limitations, and I think when in 1996 they adopted what was called GEAR, which was the first sort of move away from a much more kind of redistributive, more sort of left-wing approach to the economy and society and transforming society. After they adopted GEAR, you could still argue at that point that we're doing it because there are constraints, that white capital want to leave and so on. But then I would say they showed their hand the first time after Thabo Mbeki became president, and his solution to resolving the problem of basically, I mean, it is racial inequality. Like whatever people will tell you or beat around the bush, it is racial inequality in South Africa. Less than 1% of whites are poor. All the bulk of poor people in South Africa are also black. They happen to be black. So if you are going to deal with inequality in South Africa, you have to deal with like the racial inequality. And I think Mbeki, when I'm saying he showed his hand, was like, okay, the way I'm going to solve this is I have to create a black middle class. Like the only way I'm going to solve this is to create a black middle class using the apparatus of the state, the civil service, etc. And at the same time, opening up, creating opportunity within business, but that the party, under sort of like the protection of the political party, because hopefully then these people will turn into some kind of patriotic bourgeoisie, if you want, or something like that. Of course, it didn't work out that way, but I think that was his plan. All that sort of like two-nation talk, it was a project. It was a real project. We could judge it now, but I think that was what I want to say. One other quick point before I move on to the other section of what I think was the other move. It's easy I get Will's point about the sort of like what the ANC's original class base was, but I think Will, and I know Will concede this, that the people who were doing that kind of politics, they were also doing it under extreme conditions. It wasn't like they could become middle class. They did this despite apartheid. So it's not like we are gonna throw them under the bus because they were trying to become business people under apartheid.
Yeah, that's true.
And it sounded like that, but we're just trying to say, like, don't think they were radicals. I think like that's maybe the point we're hopefully trying to get across. I think the other part of the story is also, so when I say like instead of becoming a patriotic bourgeoisie, it quickly emerged that it was only about their own interest. So you had this like classic quote by Phumzile Mlambo Ngcuka, who was in the cabinet with Mbeki, and I think at one point he served as like deputy president of the country, saying basically we should not be ashamed to become filthy rich. So like still Ramaphosa is like owning at one point, I think he's the biggest owner of McDonald's franchises in the country. Like that's what that project then becomes. This is why people then become cynical about Black economic empowerment. Now, it is true that there was a part of society which were going to be cynical about it anyway, but I suppose there was energy for it in the society. Mbeki had like some legitimacy with that part. I think maybe not with me or Will or whoever, but it did have legitimacy. Then I think the part where Zuma then comes with their version of it is essentially, if you're going to accumulate, you must accumulate through the state. So that RET, what Will mentioned as RET, the popular phrasing is like radical economic transformation. So it sounds like a massive left-wing project, but it's really the cover for that kind of accumulation, like using the state to get rich. And then I think the last part, which I actually think is the interesting one of this, when you talk about this kind of class politics and South Africa's political class, and I know Will has something to say about this, which is one of the things that people forget about what happened in 2015 to 2017 when roads must fall and fees must fall, is that up until that point, if there were protests in South Africa, the early 2000s, with the kind of anti-eviction committee, Soweto Electricity Crisis Committee, anti-privatization forum, all that politics, even the AIDS movement of the Treatment Action Campaign, which was more a mix of sort of middle-class activists, working-class base, etc. What's interesting about Fees Must Fall, this is the first moment when the children, I would argue, often, not all of them, but a lot of them, when the beneficiaries of the ANC's policies, the actual beneficiaries of ANC policies, for whom the university was being opened up, people who are getting into grad school, people who are now, there's a possibility of becoming academics, et cetera, et cetera. It's that class that basically was like, oh, this project is not working. I'm not saying they had signed up to that project, but I think they were the first ones to kind of go like, that negotiated revolution, arguing that you had constraints, then doing your two different, your BEE and then your RET, it's not working for us. Well, RET was not really like a thing yet, but it was in the air. And then the way I think they phrase it is to say, well, it's about the symbols. It's about this kind of representational politics. But interestingly, I think they make the connection between the privatization of like essential services, between the idea that you must have free public higher education. They didn't say free education for everybody, but whatever. They did say higher education. So it's there that you see something was, if we have to stick to what's happening to that class, what's happening to African class politics, and especially the political class, then there was a hope that class was breaking up and that there was a crisis in that class, and that it wasn't only necessarily going to be to the right, to these kind of, chiefs and old ANC types, or as Will was rightly pointing out, this kind of right-wing front, sort of civic front. No, there was a possibility that out of this new elite, and I mean, I'm calling it like their children, was going to, the people, let me put it differently, the people who were going to govern South Africa, the class that was going to govern the state, govern its institutions, its universities, etc., and so on, the commerce, that class rebelled against the state. And that was a possibility that there could be something else in South Africa. But of course, again, we can't judge something. It just happened, so we have to wait and see what it might become. But that's the one little part of that story which is not depressing.